The real burning question in the world today is, does Islam and Islamic civilization actually sanction the violence that we're seeing being perpetrated in its name around the world? And to that we have to answer, if we're going to be honest about it, an unqualified yes. The Islamic sources, the Islamic texts, starting with the Quran, but not limited to the Quran, the Islamic texts including the Hadith, Islamic tradition, Islamic theology, Islamic law, the traditions of the interpretation of the Quran throughout history and Islamic history itself all bear witness to the fact that Islam has a developed doctrine, theology, and law that mandates violence against unbelievers. In Islamic theology, the Prophet Muhammad is considered al-insan al-kamil, which is the perfect man. He is the model par excellence to be imitated. He is the person that the more a Muslim is like him, the better off he is. So the Prophet Muhammad is revered today in the Islamic world as the primary model of human behavior.
Well, when Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, wiped out all the Jews from Saudi Arabia, there was 3 tribes, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa. We were proudly studying this in school as Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, ordered the beheading of the Jews of Banu Qurayza and the women being taken as concubines. As soon as a child had pubic hair, he was beheaded. So the Jewish population was either extradited or beheaded. The story of Rabbi Qanina is a well-known documented story in Islam. Rabbi Qanina was tortured by the order of the Prophet of Islam himself. His eyes were put out. He was burned in order to confess where the Jewish tribes were hiding their goods, their gold and their silver and all those kind of things. This is right from the Hadith.
Another example, that may be even more chilling, of the deleterious influence that Muhammad's example has upon the Islamic world was exemplified recently by an Egyptian leader of a radical Muslim party who wrote just recently that he couldn't believe that the beheadings in Iraq were being protested by Muslims. Weren't they aware that the Prophet Muhammad himself beheaded between 600 and 900 men personally? Didn't they realize that if the Prophet did it, then this was the proper way to behave? Now we can see then that since the Prophet Muhammad himself participated in many battles and raids and did indeed perpetrate these beheadings, he ordered the assassination of several of his political opponents, and he behaved in general like a typical 7th century warlord. The problem is that when this is transferred to 21st century behavior, 21st century contexts of behavior, then what you get are terrorists. The Quran occupies a place that has no parallel in Western civilization. The Quran is considered by Muslims and by traditional Islamic theology to be dictated word for word by God himself, by Allah himself, through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. As a result, every word of it is the words of God himself. Every word of the Quran, unless it is canceled by another section of the Quran itself, is valid for all time and cannot be questioned, cannot be reformed, cannot be changed within an Islamic context. This means that moderate Muslims, peaceful Muslims, if they are sincere, have to reject entirely Quranic literalism. But to do so puts them outside the sphere of anything that has been considered Orthodox Islam throughout history, because to do so is to reject the very basic premise of Islam, that this is a book that is dictated by God and is a perfect copy of a perfect book, the al-Kitab, the mother of the book that has existed forever with Allah in heaven.
So the Quran is simply a set of direct commandments or else narratives, descriptions, sometimes very distorted descriptions of Judaism and Christianity. Because of the normative nature of those commandments, the second important body for Islamic jurisprudence and for Islamic polity is the tradition of the Prophet, the Hadith.
Now, the Hadith are absolutely necessary to make any sense of the Quran, because Allah addresses Muhammad in the Quran and they talk about incidents in Muhammad's life, but they don't fill in the narrative details. So You have to go to the hadith, the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, in order to understand what's being said in the Quran and why. From an Islamic standpoint, if something that Muhammad said or did is recorded in one of those books, then it has authority second only to the Quran. And in those books, there is a great deal that illuminates what the Quran says and how it is applicable to Muslims in the present.
Since there is no sense of natural morality in Islam, you have to go into either the Quran or the Hadith to find out what is allowed and what is not allowed.
And in those books, we have very clear instruction from the Prophet Muhammad that it is the responsibility of Muslims to meet the unbelievers on the battlefield, to invite them either to accept Islam or to accept second-class dhimmi status in the Islamic State. And if they refuse both of those, then to wage war against them.
The Quran is broken down into two sections. One is called Makkiyah, which means what was inspired to Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, in Mecca. And one is called Madaniyah, what was inspired to the Prophet of Islam in Medina or Yathrib. In Mecca, you find much of the peaceful verses. Muhammad used to live with the Jewish community and the Christian community in peace and harmony. So there was many verses in the Quran that even the Muslims used to worship in the direction of prayer towards Jerusalem. They saw many elements of a unity between the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim faith.
There are indeed some verses in the Quran that could be called peaceful and tolerant, notably the injunction against compulsion in religion. Those verses almost invariably date back to the beginnings of Muhammad's prophetic career in his native city of Mecca, where he was powerless, where he was only beginning to attract followers. Well, it all changes with the establishment of Muhammad's theocratic statelet in the city of Medina. He becomes a warlord, he becomes the head of a totalitarian state, he becomes very rich, very powerful, and very intolerant. And then many of these early verses, in fact, get abrogated.
In Surah 2, verse 106 of the Quran, it says that if we abrogate, we being Allah, abrogate a verse, then we'll give you one that's better.
Whatever a verse, revelation, do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring a better one or similar to it. Know you not that Allah is able to do all things?
This is the basis, the foundation of the Quranic doctrine of nasikh, which is abrogation. And it is the idea that when there are verses that are contradictory or appear to be contradictory in the Quran, the one that is revealed later chronologically is better, as Allah has promised, and cancels the earlier one.
Now the violence started. Now you had to weigh between peaceful verses and non-peaceful verses.
It's very important to understand that the Quran is not arranged chronologically. It's arranged simply on the basis of the longest chapter to the shortest.
And so you will find in the book itself some of these more tolerant verses at a later point in the book than the very intolerant ones advocating violence and subjugation of infidels. But that doesn't mean they came into being later on. Quite the contrary. If there is ever a contradiction between two injunctions, the ones that came later on in Medina are the ones that retain their validity, and the early ones from Mecca have been abrogated.
The peaceful verses became mansukha, means made null and void, with verses like the verses of the sword.
Traditional Islamic theology has it that the 9th chapter of the Quran, Surah 9, is the last revealed in the career of the Prophet. And it is the only one that doesn't begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. Some have said that that's because there's no compassion or mercy in this particular chapter, and that it is the Quran's last word on jihad, and in particular on how Muslims should behave toward unbelievers. In it is the celebrated verse of the sword.
And what does the verse of the sword say? It's very clear. That when the forbidden months are over, kill the people of the book wherever you find them. Lay siege for them. Lay wait for them. Lay ambush for them. Kill them wherever you find them. Muhammad clearly stated that in the ends of days, there will be many who defect from the faith. Kill them when you see them, wherever you find them. So this is the question that the West needs to understand. What part of kill don't they understand?